For one weekend each summer, a small up-north town is invaded by pirates. These are the sounds of the Boyne City Pirate Festival. A boat full of buccaneers makes circles out in Lake Charlevoix before setting course for the marina downtown. They're armed with foam swords, waving black flags, and announcing their arrival with a conch shell and a saxophone. I'm here to document this invasion, but I've got to say, these people seem a little too friendly for pirates.
Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to the Boyne City Pirate Festival 2024. Come and get your pirate on today. Arr! I'm Steve Hoyt, Steve the Pirate.
Steve Hoyt is one of the founding members of the Boyne City Pirate Fest and serves on its board of directors.
This is the largest freshwater pirate festival in the world. Yeah. It truly is.
Is it the only freshwater pirate festival?
As far as I know, it could be. So it has two titles of being the only freshwater pirate festival and the largest freshwater pirate festival in the world.
Very cool.
Yes.
Cool, yeah.
Everyone's playing pirate this weekend, but Steve's pretty much the real deal. He's a deep-sea diver and spent 10 years on a remote island in the British West Indies, searching for shipwrecks.
And in the process, being just completely submersed in the piracy, the ancient cobblestone streets of Tortola, walking down those same streets that Blackbeard, Robert Bartholomew, and a lot of the other famous pirates throughout history were walking too. So to have those streets and those memories and that spirit still there.
This festival is inspired by one of those real pirates of history, Sadie the Goat Farrell. She lurked around the docks of New York City, mugging, plundering, and doing all the other piratey things. Legend has it, she'd attack her unsuspecting victims by headbutting them, like a goat.
Sadie is a real pirate, but the story's been kind of ad-libbed just a touch to make it, more exciting and kind of fit our profile of our pirate festival.
The ad-libbed story is that Sadie the Goat stole a ship and sailed up the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes. She made her way through the Straits of Mackinac, around the tip of the Mitten, and into Lake Charlevoix, where she buried her treasure somewhere near present-day Boyne City. Of course, this is all make-believe. As far as we know, Sadie the Goat never really sailed the inland seas, headbutting the fine people of Michigan. But the real pirates of Michigan's past, they were no saints themselves.
If the environment up here didn't kill you, your neighbor might.
That's Michael Klassen, an Upper Peninsula historian who's working on a book all about piracy in the Great Lakes.
The Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and probably northern lower Michigan too, was the Wild West before the Wild West. And there was piracy all over. I mean, for something that is as little known as piracy on the Great Lakes, it was happening all the time.
Today, Michael takes us on a dive into the archives, where we'll learn about a little-known chapter of Michigan history. We'll hear about timber pirates and their armed rebellion against the U.S. government. And we'll tell the tale of Roaring Dan Seavey, the most notorious pirate the Great Lakes have ever seen. That's coming up on Yes, Michigan.
Come and see my history unfold. Yes, Michigan, the feelings forever. Yes, Michigan, the feelings
Michael Klassen is a lifelong Michigander, a photographer, an author, and a historian. He's written several books on Michigan history, and his latest is all about the pirates of the Great Lakes.
It goes even back to the fur trade. There were fur trade pirates. There was religious pirates. There were timber pirates. There was normal, everyday, let's steal everything we can find pirates.
Michael's learned a lot about Michigan's pirating past, and is always searching through historical records for more. But his interest in the subject started a long time ago at a library in Marquette. Michael was a history student there at Northern Michigan University.
And I was thumbing through some files, and I found a file that said legends. Now, you gotta look at that. I mean, and I pulled it out, and it had the story of Dan Seavey in there.
Roaring Dan Seavey was by far Michigan's most infamous pirate, and the only person officially charged with piracy in the Great Lakes. He was known for hijacking ships, smuggling illegal goods, poaching wildlife, and starting fights in saloons around Lake Michigan. We'll get back to Dan Seavey and his roaring ways in a bit, but first, we'll start in the years leading up to the Civil War, a time when Michigan was the new frontier of a young United States, and one full of treasure, but not buried treasure, the kind that grows above the ground.
The white pine was really what they were looking for. The white pine was the most valuable of them all. It was the largest, and you could get the most lumber out of a log.
The eastern white pine, the official state tree of Michigan, was used to frame homes and businesses across the growing Midwest. In fact, after the Chicago Fire of 1871, the city was rebuilt almost exclusively with towering white pines from northern Michigan and Wisconsin. The vast timber resources made this region a gold mine. And where there's gold, there's pirates.
And they were everywhere, and they were hugely plentiful. They would whip into an area, cut down 40 or 20, load them up on the ships, and be gone.
For decades in the mid-1800s, these timber pirates sailed the Great Lakes, dropping white pines as fast as their axes could swing and their crosscut saws could crosscut saw. They pillaged the forests along the shores of northern Michigan, land that was only recently obtained by the federal government through treaties with the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And Michael says that, while they were breaking the law, these weren't the type of pirates that struck fear into the people. In fact, most of the recent settlers in the region supported what the timber pirates were doing.
The settlers always saw trees as their enemy. They were in the way, they were a nuisance, you couldn't farm, you had to pull them up and get them gone. So consequently, the timber pirates were actually sort of heroes, in a sense. They kept real popular amongst the locals, even to the extent if they were arrested, they'd break them out of jail.
Despite the pirates' popularity, the feds decided the situation was out of control. By the 1840s, Michigan's forests were falling fast, and the government wanted to cut and sell those trees itself. So, in comes the USS Michigan, an ironclad warship, the first of its kind in the U.S. Navy. The crew's job was to stop the pirates at all costs, and send a message that this young country would defend its new territories. The conflict that followed is known as the Timber Rebellion, but Michael says it was more like a game of cat and mouse than a full-on war.
It was the only law on the water for 4 lakes. And you're talking Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior. So consequently, if it was on one lake, it was a free-for-all on the other 3. It couldn't cover that type of territory to really be effective from a law enforcement standpoint. And they were blocked at different places by the population and the public who wanted to see the trees gone.
And even when the USS Michigan did catch timber pirates red-handed, they were pirates. They weren't going down without a fight.
One of the ships even rammed the Michigan. All reports were that it was damaged so badly that if it wouldn't have been an ironclad, it would have sunk.
So it wouldn't be accurate to say the U.S. Navy really stopped the timber pirates in Michigan. The conflict sort of just petered out, partly because almost all the trees were gone by the end of the century. Only a few small pockets of old-growth forest survived the logging boom known as the cutover, most notably the towering trees at Hartwick Pines State Park in Grayling, where some of the white pines are more than 400 years old. You should go see them if you haven't. Michael Klassen says another factor that brought an end to the Timber Rebellion was one of the biggest turning points in U.S. history.
The onset of the Civil War changed a lot of things for everything. I mean, it was seismic for the entire country.
As war broke out, many of the timber pirates and the crew of the USS Michigan likely found themselves fighting for the same side, against the Confederacy. The Civil War and its aftermath would dominate headlines and history books for decades to come, as the Timber Rebellion faded into obscurity. But it wasn't the end of piracy in Michigan. Not yet. In fact, Michigan's most undeniably piratey pirate was also its last.
He liked to fight. I mean, he really liked to fight. He claimed that nobody could beat him. He was in saloons, he was very loud, he was very boisterous.
He was roaring.
Yeah.
Roaring Dan Seavey was born in Maine in 1865, and it was there he fell in love with the sea. He left home at the age of 13 and became a sailor, then spent some time in the Navy before settling in Wisconsin on the shores of Lake Michigan. He got married, had a daughter, and found work as a fisherman, a farmer, and a Milwaukee saloon owner. But eventually, his inner pirate got the better of him, and he left his young family in search of gold. Seavey joined more than 100,000 Americans in the Klondike Gold Rush, traveling thousands of miles through Alaska and Canada's Yukon Territory. But for Dan, like most of the prospectors, the whole gold thing didn't pan out.
And, of course, came back empty-handed and ended up starting to plunder Lake Michigan.
Seavey still had a family in Milwaukee, one he'd never see again. He set up a new home base in Escanaba and obtained a sail-powered schooner ship called the Wanderer. He set up base camps all over Lake Michigan, where he poached deer and sold venison to markets in Chicago, especially in the fall when meat was scarce. That upset a certain Booth Fishing Company, a Chicago-based market with ties to organized crime.
The gang set out one of their boats to take over his territory. After a vicious fight, he was chased away by overwhelming odds. Victorious, the gang started back to Chicago with their news of success.
But the fight wasn't over. Seavey leveled up. It was just about dusk when he caught up with the gangsters in his ship, the Wanderer.
Again, a tough fight ensued, but this time the pirate had equalized the odds by bringing a cannon that he had pulled and mounted onto the bow of his boat. The fight ended when Seavey blew the other boat out of the water. None of the gang ever returned to Chicago, and Seavey made it well known that the same fate was in store for anyone who tried to cross him.
This marks the true beginning of Roaring Dan Seavey's reign of terror on Lake Michigan.
When he put the cannon on the Wanderer, he actually became quite formidable, and he would pull into any port. If there was something there that wasn't tied down, including a ship, he would steal it.
One of Roaring Dan's favorite methods of thievery was a common pirating practice called moon cussing. It involved tampering with an iconic symbol of Michigan's identity, the lighthouse.
What it is you go out on a dark night, okay? You put out the lights of the lighthouse, and then you build a fire, often in a wood stove or something along the shoreline next to a rock reef, and then you would open it and close it, simulating a lighthouse light, and they would come up onto the reefs. Hence the term moon cussers, because you want them to accidentally, on purpose, run into these rocks. And so if the moon came out, whether even half full, you get an incredible moonlight on the water. And you can see any type of disruption in the water, which is what they didn't want to have happen.
And then when the ship runs aground, the pirates board and plunder, right?
Right. Of course, when they run aground, most of the crew is going to try to use a lifeboat or whatever to get to shore, abandons the ship. It's there for the pickings. We talk about a lot of ships being lost in storms. I expect a fair percentage of them were also lost to pirates.
Roaring Dan carried on robbing, poaching, plundering, and moon cussing on Lake Michigan for decades. But Michael says that in 1908, Seavey went a step too far. He came aboard a yacht called the Nellie Johnson with crates full of liquor. After getting the crew drunk, he threw the captain overboard and took off to sell the cargo on the black market in Chicago. But the feds caught wind and took after him in a much faster ship, a cutter called the Tuscarora.
The chase went on throughout much of the night, but Seavey knew the waters much better than the crew of the cutter. As he passed a harbor buoy, Seavey shot the light out and replaced it with a lantern on a barrel.
Moon cussing, classic Roaring Dan.
Tuscarora ran aground, but a change in the wind direction also changed Seavey's luck. The stranded cutter fired a cannon shot across the yacht's bow, and he was forced to surrender. He was taken to Chicago in chains to stand trial for pirating the Nellie Johnson. He's also the only person to ever have been prosecuted for piracy in the Great Lakes. None of them were ever taken to court over it until he came along.
Seavey swore for the rest of his life that he won the Nellie Johnson from its captain in a poker game. That argument didn't hold up in court. But Seavey never did any jail time. Instead, he struck a deal. He'd work with the U.S. Marshals Service to crack down on poaching, smuggling, and piracy on Lake Michigan. He'd be a sort of double agent.
Also, with Dan now on the side of the law, a good portion of the illegal activities were expected to cease because he was a major contributor.
Yeah. But Michael says just because Seavey was now a lawman, his wild ways didn't really change.
He tracked down an outlaw who had been stealing and selling whiskey, and Dan located him in a saloon in Nobbenway.
That's about a 40-minute drive west of St. Ignace in modern-day Michigan.
The outlaw told him, "If you can drag me outside, I'll board your schooner to Chicago." A few drinks, the fight started. Literally, hours of fighting followed, wrecking the saloon, to occasionally stop for a drink or two of whiskey. Finally, Seavey slammed the outlaw against the bar, breaking most of the bottles of liquor. Afraid that there wouldn't be enough whiskey left to finish the fight, he knocked the man down and placed a piano on his neck. After downing a few more shots of whiskey, he reconsidered and lifted the piano off the outlaw and asked him to join him in another drink before resuming the fight. The outlaw never got up. Wow. Of course.
I mean, that's something out of a Wild West movie, for real.
It is. You know, the more you dig into it, the more you come across these kinds of stories. You know, they're all out there.
That particular fight cost Dan Seavey his badge as a U.S. Marshal. Go figure. He settled down and spent his later years back in Wisconsin, and not much was heard from the former pirate. Although, rumor has it, he made the occasional surprise appearance in the UP.
I frequently do events where I'm out selling books. And I do Escanaba at least a couple of times a year. And I had somebody come up to me and say that, when they were a kid out fishing, this guy came up to him and told them they were doing it all wrong. You got to raise your bait up off the bottom, and you got to have it up about this high and all this other stuff. Gave them both the kids that were there fishing 50 cents and 100 off. Anyways, some guy come up to the kids and said, "Do you know who that was?" And the kids are like, no idea. "Well, that was Captain Dan Seavey. He's the pirate." And the guy looked at me and says, even after the guy said that, I still don't know who the hell he was.
But that's amazing. I mean, I'm sure this person was advanced in age, but it still shows, like, this is history, but it's not as long ago as we might think when we think about pirates.
Seavey actually died in like 1949. So a lot of what he was doing was late 1800s up into the early to mid 1900s. So he, was really pretty active around a time when the lakes were getting really civilized. We're seeing cars, we're seeing motorcycles, we're seeing all sorts of different things at that time.
And there's still a pirate running around.
Yeah.
So he's sort of the remnant of the Great Lakes past that kind of hung around into its changing future, yeah?
Sure.
Despite all his plundering, Seavey died penniless at a nursing home in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Those who knew him towards the end described him as a soft-spoken, polite, and poor old man. You might have never known you were speaking to the last of the Great Lakes pirates. But for those who want this forgotten piece of Michigan's past to live on, there's always Boyne City.
The King of Charlevoix.
Nowhere else in the world will you find this kind of entertainment. It's a Key West style of street performing that you'll find in northern Michigan, north of the 45th.
All right, listen to the governor. Yes, Michigan, the feelings forever.
Yes, Michigan is an MLive production, written and produced by me, Patrick Shea, and edited by Jillian Van Straat. Music for this episode from Kevin MacLeod, and our theme song is by Tom Anthony and Gavin Spencer. Stay tuned next week for a Halloween special on the Dog Man, Michigan's own cryptic creature. You can find more great stories and breaking news from around the state at our website, MLive.com. Thanks for listening.